Hey there, fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. If you're into stories that make your skin crawl and keep you up at night, then buckle up because this one's a doozy. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The ferry passenger who never disembarked at Sitka. On a cool morning in Sitka, port workers watched a ferry ease through Sitka Sound while gulls traced slow circles overhead. The vessel's horn rolled over water that smelled of kelp and diesel and early rain. Among the manifested arrivals, one name would reportedly remain unanswered at the terminal doors. People wheeled bags across wet pavement while radio traffic clicked and paused around the ramp. The absence did not ring alarms first, it only lingered as a missing footstep in a practiced routine. The passenger, listed as Charles Weaver, was 62, a retired accountant from Spokane traveling to Sitka to visit his younger sister. He had boarded at Juneau 2 nights earlier, carrying one rolling suitcase and a canvas daypack. A purser noted his quiet demeanor and a habit of reading schedules taped beside stairwells. State records list his height, his gray hair, and an emergency contact with a Washington area code. His purpose in Sitka was simple. He planned to help arrange minor repairs at a family rental. The crew roster that week included a junior deckhand named Ian, 27, who worked nights cleaning rails and checking life rings. He remembered a man matching Weaver's description standing alone near the stern during the long run south. The wind carried spray and conversation toward the cafeteria, where lights stayed warm through the small hours. Some travelers slept against windows, while others played cards near vending machines that hummed against the bulkhead. Ian said he noticed the man review a folded map, then pocket it when the aisle cleared. Dispatch logs from the terminal record the arrival time at dawn, with light rain sweeping across Baranof Island. The ramp grounded against the apron, and trucks rolled off while several pedestrians gathered under a metal awning. A clerk scanned barcodes as passengers filed past a yellow line where a guard checked random bags. The logs show a brief power flicker in the terminal hall, then a reset that lasted under 1 minute. No incident codes were assigned, and operations resumed without delay or comment. Weaver's sister reached the terminal late after a stalled school zone detour near Sawmill Creek Road. She parked near the chain-link fence and watched the last pedestrians scatter toward taxis and waiting relatives. By her account, the rain slowed and a mist sat low across Crescent Harbor. She checked her phone and called twice. Without success, the calls rang without answer, and times were stamped in her provider records. She later told officers she felt uneasy without any specific reason beyond a silence that extended past habit. When baggage carts emptied, a single gray suitcase circled on the belt with no claimant stepping forward to lift it away. The tag matched Weaver's name and routing, printed in black on a laminated slip. A terminal agent moved the suitcase behind a counter and wrote a simple note on a clipboard. No alarm was triggered because unclaimed luggage appears with predictable frequency on rainy mornings. The agent set the suitcase on a shelf and returned to help a couple searching for a misplaced fishing rod. Archived notes taken that afternoon indicate officers spoke separately with 2 travelers who remembered a man fitting the description. One was an art teacher from Sitka who sketched whales from the solarium during the night hours. She recalled the man leaning on the rail near Mount Edgecombe's faint outline when clouds parted for a moment. Another was a mechanic from Ketchikan who said the same man bought coffee twice and asked about taxi prices in town. Investigators never confirmed the timing with receipts, and no surveillance covered the solarium benches. The county file from 2009 in a separate missing traveler case shows a similar pattern of unclaimed baggage and unclear disembarkation. That earlier file included a ferry manifest, a terminal sweep, and door checks against wind gusts that sometimes move latches. It also noted how passengers occasionally exit through service doors when following crew in reflective jackets. In that instance, the traveler was located later at a motel near a cannery road after walking away in heavy rain. Investigators compared the patterns, yet the Sitka details failed to line up cleanly. Ferry officers reviewed internal access logs for closed stairwells that connect vehicle decks and passenger spaces. They found no anomalies, only routine entries by maintenance staff checking bilge alarms and a cleaner replacing paper towels. A camera near the cafeteria recorded partial views of faces during meal hours but missed the corridor leading to the aft lounge. Reviewers watched the files twice and logged timestamps at 5-minute intervals to mark movement clusters. Some locals claimed an extra gap appeared near the end of the recording, yet technicians reported no dropped frames. At midweek, state records show officers walked the shoreline on both sides of the terminal looking for disturbed kelp lines. The tide had fallen quickly after the ferry's docking, leaving slick rocks and sand flecked with broken shells. They checked ladders, pilings, and fenders for fibers or scuffs that might indicate contact with clothing or bags. A harbor patrol boat swept the inner channel while rain stiffened from the south and visibility narrowed along the hills. Nothing turned up beyond a hat band caught on a cleat that belonged to someone else. Weaver's phone connected briefly to a tower outside town at a time that conflicted with the expected walk-off window. Analysts plotted pings against ferry timetables and decided the reading could reflect device drift under poor weather. A later attempt to triangulate from neighboring towers gave no additional certainty for the immediate period following docking. The device never registered a data session in Sitka proper, and voicemail remained unchanged for several days. The phone was eventually found powered down inside the gray suitcase held behind the terminal counter. When officers opened the suitcase with the sisters' consent, they found clothing folded tightly and a small bottle of vitamins. There was also a spiral notebook with mileage notes and simple arithmetic tracking gas costs for earlier segments of travel. A handwritten list named tasks in Sitka, including a visit to a plumbing supplier and a stop at a family storage unit. Nothing suggested immediate plans beyond errands that fit a short visit. The day pack remained missing, and no one recalled seeing it after the ship's cafeteria closed for the night. A taxi dispatcher reportedly checked logs and found no record of a pickup under Weaver's name during the docking hour. Drivers sometimes accept cash riders who wave at the curb, which complicates documentation on wet mornings when lines are short. One driver remembered a man stepping toward the curb, then turning away while fastening his jacket. The driver could not establish the face, and weather limited the view through the windshield that kept fogging despite the fan. The report noted the uncertainty without assigning weight, and the lead stayed open. Some locals claimed the man left the ship early through a service door when the deckhands repositioned chocks around wheel wells. Crew statements conflicted on door status because procedures allow short openings during shifts and quick closures afterward. A safety officer said those doors close against air pressure that resists casual pushes from the outside. He added that wind can trick hinges and create sounds that resemble latches when traffic moves on the ramp. Investigators never confirmed external access during that window, and the theory remained a line in the file. Searchers walked the footpath toward Totem Park, checking benches and thickets where travelers sometimes paused to adjust bags. Rain lifted briefly, and a weak sun set bands of silver across Sitka Sound, while ravens scolded from cedar branches. A groundskeeper reported no new camps or discarded bottles that would suggest a hasty stop. Officers spoke with staff at a nearby cafe who said the morning trade moved quickly with fishermen and hospital employees. No one recalled a man drip-drying near the heater or holding a map with ferry schedules. The sister called relatives in Washington and asked about any change of plans that might redirect the visit. None were reported, and bank activity remained consistent with a careful traveler who used small cash purchases along the route. A credit card charge at Juneau showed a ferry cafeteria meal during a schedule break between legs. There were no Sitka charges and no attempts at withdrawals from machines that dripped onto the pavement near the lot. The patterns suggested momentum toward Sitka, then a full stop without financial movement afterward. Investigators checked hospitals and clinics for admissions, matching Weaver's age and description during the week after arrival. No patient aligned with his file, and air ambulance logs listed unrelated cases tied to remote villages and fishing accidents. The harbormaster distributed a brief notice to smaller docks asking attendants to report unattended bags. A trooper walked through a gear shop and asked about any customer who seemed lost or wet beyond the usual rain. Staff could not connect the details to a specific person, and the inquiry ended without a lead. A month later, a hiker on a trail above the Indian River claimed to see a jacket sleeve tangled near a root. Officers climbed the slope and found a torn piece of nylon that had weathered through 2 storm cycles. Fabric comparators could not match the weave to Weaver's clothing because the suitcase sample lacked similar material. The location strained the timeline, given the docking hour and the limited paths out of the terminal. The note entered the file under unverified observation and did not change the working summary. When analysts wrote their concluding memo, they listed elements that aligned with a simple failure to disembark through the usual doors. They paired those with elements that resisted such a reading, including the phone found later with no tower contact in Sitka. They added a paragraph on ferry architecture and how movement patterns complicate any reconstruction when cameras leave gaps between spaces. A final section summarized the sister's persistent calls and her quiet visits to the shoreline in the weeks following. The memo ended with language indicating records conflict and that the absence remains without a confirmed path. Years later, the terminal agent remembered the morning every time an unclaimed bag circled the belt after a rainy docking. The memory did not carry definitive images, only small impressions tied to radio clicks and the short flicker in the hall. State records continued to list Weaver as missing, with a note that he was last associated with a scheduled ferry arrival. The file stayed active in annual audits and drew brief attention whenever travelers asked about old cases related to the route. Nothing further emerged, and the routine at the dock moved on with gulls and diesel and rain. The stories. Why the paramedic returned to that turnout. In early March of 2017, a state trooper found a decommissioned ambulance parked just off a mountain turnout east of Ridge County. The vehicle was empty, its back doors wide open, with one boot and a stethoscope left on the asphalt. It was later confirmed the items belonged to a paramedic named Mark Renner, who had driven that same route almost exactly 1 year earlier. What drew him back to the same turnout became the center of one of the strangest internal reviews in the county's emergency services history. Mark was 39, a quiet man who'd spent nearly 2 decades in the field. He'd seen wrecks, fires, and overdoses, the kind of scenes that hollowed out most people within a few years, but he stayed steady. Colleagues said he was professional, unshakable. The only story that ever seemed to trouble him was an accident from late February of 2016. A head-on collision on Route 92 involving a young couple and their infant daughter. The child had survived for 23 minutes in his care before the helicopter arrived, but the parents hadn't made it. Mark never forgot her crying. That sound stayed with him long after the shift ended. According to dispatch logs, Mark stopped requesting overnight shifts after that incident. He rotated into training duties for a few months, then back to field work once he was cleared by department counseling. Nothing seemed off until that following March, when he quietly signed up for the same overnight route, the same mountain stretch, and never came home. Investigators later reconstructed his movements from station cameras and gas receipts. He'd clocked in at 7:04 p.m., stopped for coffee at a roadside diner around 8:30, and drove north up the highway before pulling into the turnout just after 9:10. The dash cam on his unit, recovered from the ambulance, recorded 19 minutes of footage before cutting out. It showed a still landscape, empty road, light snow, and Mark stepping out of the cab, walking toward the guardrail, then disappearing into the dark. There was no struggle, no second figure, no sound beyond the wind. The first assumption was suicide. But the ground search found no trace. No footprints beyond a few feet from the guardrail, no sign of a fall down the ravine. The terrain was steep but not lethal, and cadaver dogs found nothing. When heavy rains swept through 2 days later, investigators halted the search. The county logged it as a presumed drowning, though the river below was shallow and slow-moving that time of year. Nearly 6 months passed before anything new surfaced. In August, a hiker found a sealed envelope wedged beneath a loose plank at a forest overlook, about 3 miles from the turnout. Inside was a folded piece of paper in a waterproof bag, written in uneven block letters. "I came back because I heard her." The note was signed M.R. and dated the same night Mark vanished. At first, analysts dismissed it as a hoax, maybe something left by someone who'd followed the case in the news. But when the lab examined the paper, they confirmed partial fingerprints matching Mark's employment file. The note's ink also matched a brand of pen issued in ambulance restock kits that year. For a while, speculation spread quietly through the department. Some said Mark had been unstable, still haunted by the loss of the infant. Others insisted he'd been fine. Then, an old colleague, a retired dispatcher named Ruth Canning, came forward with something she'd kept an archived radio call from the night of his disappearance. She hadn't turned it in earlier because she thought it was just static bleed from another channel, but she'd kept the recording out of habit. When the file was cleaned and enhanced, it revealed something strange. A faint secondary voice overlaying Mark's transmission. He'd called in a routine report. Unit 307, clear, returning to station. But beneath his words was another voice, faint and distorted, repeating a single phrase, still here. Audio experts couldn't fully isolate the sound. It could have been cross-channel interference, a bleed from another frequency, or an artifact from faulty wiring. Still, that clip reignited interest in the case. When investigators compared the timestamps, they realized the radio call had been made exactly 1 minute before the dashcam cut out. Following the renewed attention, a new team reviewed Mark's digital trail. On his department-issued tablet, recovered from the front seat, the last accessed file wasn't a dispatch log. It was a photo stored in a personal folder labeled Training Refs. The image, according to metadata, had been taken 1 year earlier on the night of the crash. It showed the infant's car seat illuminated by the ambulance's interior light with a small knitted blanket tucked inside. Nothing seemed unusual until they enhanced the reflection on the rear window. A faint outline of Mark turned toward the seat, mouth open as if speaking. The lead investigator, Lieutenant Harris, later told a local paper that what struck him most wasn't the evidence, but the timing. Every major event in Mark's final weeks corresponded with the accident's anniversary, the same dates, the same hours, even the same shift requests. It was as if he'd been tracing the exact pattern of that night. The county eventually filed its final report as undetermined circumstances. The official narrative suggested exhaustion, stress, and possible exposure contributing to disorientation and accidental injury. Yet, off the record, several responders admitted unease. One firefighter recalled hearing a distant sound of crying during the initial search, echoing faintly through the ravine, though no infant was ever found. In 2018, the turnout was repaved and renamed, and most people moved on. But every year, around late February, local radio operators report short bursts of static on the old EMS frequency. They last only seconds and usually coincide with wind gusts off the ridge. Nothing verifiable ever transmits through. Today, a small marker stands at that turnout, a simple white post with no inscription. Truckers still pull over there to check their brakes before the steep descent. Some say if you stop long enough, the silence feels heavier than it should, as if the air itself remembers something unresolved. No one ever proved what happened to Mark Renner. Theories range from a fall to voluntary disappearance, even to mistaken identity. What remains certain is that he returned there by choice. The note, the radio call, the anniversary, all pointed toward a man circling back to a moment he couldn't let go of. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A paramedic haunted by one unfinished call, a turnout carved into the mountainside, and an unanswered question that time refused to bury. The rest is silence, the kind that fills the air between sirens, waiting for someone to break it again. The stories. This highway turnout kept a secret roadside ledger. The turnout sat 3 miles past the hill crest, where the shoulder widened and an old guardrail curled around scrub pines. It looked like any layover patch on a western freight route, wind-scoured and sun-bleached, the kind of place drivers used when the low gear cooked too hot. Ivo Calderon was 34 and worked highway maintenance out of a county yard near a small valley town. He had the steady patience of someone who counted reflectors at dawn, and he kept a pocket notebook for bolts that liked to work loose. He planned a simple loop that Tuesday: swap a cracked mile marker, replace a dented sign, check the culvert at the turnout. He pulled the county pickup beside the rail and killed the engine, and the quiet after the fan belt felt too clean. He had heard drivers call the turnout a good place to let brakes breathe, and earlier dispatch chatter mentioned a stalled sedan reported before sunrise. The sedan was gone now, but a dark rectangle pressed into gravel showed where tires had slept. He walked the rail, tapped bolts with a wrench, and found a new scar where the metal had curled inward like a knuckle. He crouched to look for glass or plastic, and his fingers met tin. The box felt cold despite the heat, wedged under the rail post with two flat rocks bracing it tight. He checked for snakes first, then slid it out with a sand scuff. Inside was a ledger wrapped in a cut trash bag, bound with string, edges rubbed thin as old denim. On the first page, someone had printed Mile 37 turnout, keep it dry, return it where you found it. The handwriting was neat, each line pressed with a heavy hand that understood trucks and weather. The early entries read like a log of small trades, which made sense in that place and on that road. Diesel siphoned and replaced with cash, jump starts marked with initials, spare brake light bulbs counted like borrowed pencils. The dates were written carefully as words, like 2019 and 2020, and then the numbers stopped for a while when the world went strange. He flipped to a recent page and noticed a different style, lighter ink and quicker strokes that curled on the downstroke. It said, "Skimmer crew parked by mile 32 according to a driver. Call the county before you accept a tow." Another said, "Gray sedan with a trailer ball gave bottles and left at dawn. Check camera near the crest for plate." He looked at the tin again and found a folded slip beneath the ledger that smelled like lemon cleaner. Someone had written, "If you find this and you work the road, please look at dispatch logs from last winter." He recognized the phrasing and the gentle push, not a demand, more like a tired neighbor asking you to look through a fence. He set the ledger back in the tin, snapped a quick photo for memory, and secured the box the way he had found it. The air felt still, and a low thunder came from the downshift of a distant semi that needed the long lane more than talk. He got in the truck, scratched a date in his pocket notebook, and drove back toward the yard with the uneasy feeling of stepping on a path with fresh footprints. In the office after lunch, he pulled archived calls on the shared computer, which the crew used for storm maps and shift swap. The log from late winter listed a cluster of calls around mile 30, with drivers reporting a two-truck team that arrived fast and unasked. One entry used the word predatory, which was rare in casual notes, and another mentioned cash prices on a scrap of paper. He kept reading and saw a note from a county deputy about skimmers on card readers at a nearby fuel plaza. That plaza sat between the crest and the river bridge, where drivers liked to grab coffee and plug in sleepers to keep a steady chill. He printed the page, then printed the call clusters, and wrote the turnout mile in the margins because he trusted his own ink. The next morning, he returned to the route early, with a thermos and a camera that clipped to the dash like a square eye. He planned to change a reflector near the crest and let the camera watch the turnout. Nothing secret, just habit dressed as curiosity. The road held a thin fog that looked like breath on glass, and the pines below the rail felt damp enough to keep a secret. He parked, waited a few minutes, and watched a box truck pull in slow with brakes sighing like someone settling into a couch. A woman climbed out, mid-40s, hair tied back, shoulders set like someone who carried more than straps and ratchets. She checked her wheels, knocked her lugs with a bar, then walked to the guardrail with a mason jar wrapped in a towel. She crouched where the tin lived, did not look around, and worked like a person who practiced in silence and noticed the small things. She took the ledger out, slid in the folded towel, wrote 3 lines, then added a smaller page clipped by a binder clip that made a sharp click. He felt guilty watching and looked down to pretend his coffee needed attention, which it did not, but pretend worked anyway. He waited until she left, then pretended to check the culvert again, this time with a small shovel that made the roll feel official. He eased the tin out, opened the ledger to the fresh page, and read a tidy note that felt like a breadcrumb. It said, "Tow crew again, near mile 32 last night. Reportedly told a young driver they worked with the county." Another line said, "I am leaving 4 bottles of coolant and a bag of rags for anyone stuck with a pinhole." He wrote a line himself, kept to the ledger tone, and made sure the ink did not bleed through on the thin paper. He wrote, "County maintenance checked the turnout, no affiliation with tow crews, call dispatch if pressured." He tucked his page under the binder clip and slid everything back, angling the rocks to wedge firm because small rituals matter when the wind gets ideas. He drove to the fuel plaza later that morning, the one near the bridge where the skimmers had allegedly lived, and asked around. The cashier, a young guy with a careful haircut, said a retired radio operator sometimes handed out paper maps to drivers who looked lost. Reportedly, he kept notes on who needed help and who pushed scams, and he liked the old ways more than the new screens. The cashier said, "You want Arlene, not me," and pointed at the small sandwich counter where a woman was sorting bread with clean hands. Arlene had the posture of someone who had stood for decades without complaint, and her eyes moved fast, like she listened with more than ears. She listened to Evo explain his job and his curiosity, then nodded once, like a shop teacher hearing a decent plan. She said, "There is a book, but we do not write full names because we do not want fights here." She said, "Some truckers leave notes about who helped, and sometimes they warn about boys who show up too fast with chains." She added, "A retired dispatcher named Theo started it after 2014 when the corner got tricky, and people forgot how to flag without yelling. Ivo asked if anyone had brought up mile 32 in the last month, and she looked past him like she was reading a chalkboard on a far wall. She said, a kid in a small coupe said 2 trucks boxed him at night and tried to sell a winch like a miracle. She said the kid left when another driver pulled behind him with hazards blinking, which often makes a different kind of math happen. He thanked her and bought a sandwich he had not planned to buy, then sat in his truck and wrote lines in his pocket notebook. He marked the phrases retired dispatcher, ledger, tow scam, and noted that older hands tend to leave cleaner trails than noisy crews. He waited for his coffee to cool, then called the deputy listed on the winter logs and left a message saying he was checking a few things near the crest. The deputy called back that afternoon, voice calm, words clipped like someone who learned to talk over traffic noise. The deputy said there had been several reports of quick tow teams and a few complaints about skimmers, but nothing firm enough for a charge. He added that a neighbor near the climb heard engines idling around midnight often, and his dog growled the way dogs do when a rhythm is wrong. Ivo returned to the turnout at dusk with a reflective vest and a flashlight because nothing good happens when you pretend the dark is friendly. He checked the tin and found another page, this one printed with careful block letters like a patient teacher. It said, "If you need to know, check the gate camera on the service road above the crest and ask for last January." He knew the service road, a narrow cut that served a radio tower, and a wind monitor the county refused to replace. The gate had an old camera that fed a shared system, which logged plates and headlights more than faces and worked better than anyone expected. He sent a request through the county portal and asked for January footage from late night hours, and the reply came with a link and a warning about file size. He watched the clips after dinner on the break room monitor because the screen at home had a cracked corner he never fixed. In one clip, the turnout sat dark and empty until a pair of flatbeds eased in like wolves that knew the fence lines. Minutes later, a small hatchback rolled to a stop, hazard lights pulsing a tired heartbeat, and the flatbeds moved as if pulled by the same string. He watched the first driver step out and talk with quick hands, then watched the second driver circle the hatchback like it had a scent. A third vehicle pulled in and stopped behind the hatchback, a high sleeper with long antenna wires and an American flag sticker on the lower door. The hatchback backed away slow, then faster, and left the turnout with the sleeper following, which made the flatbeds idle in place. Next, he watched late January. And this clip hurt because the rain made everything shine like a wet stage where actors forgot their lines. A refrigerated trailer pulled in with smoke from one wheel, a soft gray that looked almost polite until it thickened at the edges. Within minutes, 2 figures worked the hub, one with a small extinguisher, one holding a flashlight, steady and calm, even as the smoke turned rude. The next page of the ledger joined the footage in his mind and made something click that felt like a seatbelt slipping into place. The page listed a night where a driver named Ash met a retired radio man who carried a milk crate of fuses and flagged traffic by feel. It said Ash made it to the next exit and left a case of water behind the rail as thanks, and the radio man refused cash with a stubborn grin. He started to suspect the ledger was not only a list of favors or warnings, but a quiet schedule for kindness that traveled under the grid. The binder clips held more than paper, they held little runs of trust, and a handful of people had decided the turnout would be a tiny town square. He still had to connect the tow crews to something more firm, or at least line up a clean path between names and nights. He reviewed the January footage again, then compared timestamps against dispatch logs, and found a gap where a call had been recorded but then labeled incomplete. The call preview mentioned a shaky voice saying 2 trucks had blocked a lane near mile 32, and another voice saying help was already on the way. The logs showed no county units listed, and the note ended with line dropped, likely lost signal. He printed the clip stills and wrote notes by hand, careful to keep letters large and unhurried because speed ruined more ink than rain. He visited the plaza again and asked Arlene if she knew a retired radio man named Theo, which made her mouth twitch like a bad joke arrived late. She said Theo still came in on Thursdays to trade old surplus radios for stories he liked better than the radios themselves. On Thursday, she waved Evo to a small table near the window where a thin man sat with a canvas cap and a careful breath. Theo looked at the stills without touching them and asked easy questions about wind direction and how long the trucks had stayed put. He read the ledger note photocopy and raised one eyebrow at the refund line where someone had scratched out an unkind word. Theo said, "That book started when we lost a pullout after a washout in 2014 and needed somewhere to map goodwill." He said, "We kept names light on purpose. No addresses, no hero stories, just notes that kept people honest enough to look in the mirror." He added, "I have reported the cruise twice with plates, but the plates led to a rental maze that likes to erase footprints." Ivo asked if Theo would mind adding a line that county maintenance knew the ledger existed, and Theo nodded once like a metronome. He wrote in a tight script, "County eyes know this book and prefer its honesty, no affiliation with any tow company." He slid the pen back with 2 fingers, then told a quick story about a snow chain locker that used to freeze shut and how a hammer can respect stubborn metal without breaking it. The next week, Evo placed a small metal cabinet behind the rail, painted brown like the dirt, no markings, no lock, just a storm latch. Inside, he put rags, coolant, a cheap inflator, and a folded card that said, "Call dispatch and wait if anyone pressures you about towing." The ledger went into the cabinet with its tin, and a note asked writers to close the latch because the wind enjoyed rude jokes. Word spread in the slow way good habits move when they do not ask for attention or applause. Drivers left cleaner notes with times and directions that avoided names, and one traveler wrote a careful line about a black dog that lay near the rail at night to watch tires pass like planets. A deputy added, quietly and without badge number, that a new camera watched the mile 32 shoulder from an angle the crews did not expect. In early summer, a box truck driver named Kelda wrote about a man who flagged her down and pointed to a soft tire, then asked for cash. She wrote, "I offered water and a phone call, and he left without names," and a second car watched from the shadow near the sign. 2 days later, someone wrote, "Gray sedan again, park lights off, backed away when 2 vehicles pulled in together. Report filed at the substation." The plaza cashier taped a simple note near the register that said, "Tow authorization is free by county phone. Ask before you pay anyone." The retired radio man drew a small map to the turnout for a college kid hauling a couch and told him to rest his brakes in the shade because patience kept families alive. The kid returned a week later and left a bag of chips and a soft drink in the cabinet with a note that said, "Thanks for the air." Evo felt the road change by inches, the way a river shifts after a downed tree moves just enough to stop a hidden whirl. He still checked bolts and reflectors, he still swept glass after fender kisses, he still logged storms the way farmers count clouds. He also read the ledger when the latch stuck, and he understood that small tools, shared quietly, can be stronger than loud plants. In late summer, a line appeared in a new hand, careful and slow, as if the writer wanted the words to stand up straight. It said, "2 trucks tried a price on a young couple in a silver van near mile 32 last night. Another driver blocked and called." It ended, deputies arrived, reportedly took reports, crews left before plates could be confirmed, camera angle, improved view. Ivo printed that line for the deputy and handed over the catalyst chain he had assembled, which was not a case file, just a path. The deputy said thanks without a smile and later called to say a larger investigation had opened that spanned beyond their stretch of quiet hills. He did not ask for the ledger, and he did not tell Ivo to stop watching. He only asked that the book stay clean of full names to protect decent people. The turnout kept breathing in its slow way, heat riding off gravel in visible waves that made everything wobble and dreamlike. The ledger pages grew soft at the corners, and someone glued reinforced strips to the spine with care that matched the first handwriting. Now and then, a new driver wrote a sentence that sounded grateful for a simple jug of water left by a stranger with a pencil. A local professor left a note about starting a small roadside history project and asked if anyone minded a photocopy at the library. Theo wrote yes, but keep the copy without names, use dates written as words, and call it the Mile 37 book. The library later displayed a scan that showed a landscape of small trades and warnings, nothing dramatic, just a community stitched by traffic and time. Ivo stopped keeping his own separate notes once the system felt stable enough to grow without him tugging at every thread. He still checked the cabinet latch, still wiped dust off the tin, still tightened bolts with gloves that smelled like oil. And Sunday, he understood the ledger worked because it was specific but humble, and because no one wanted ownership beyond a steady line and clear daylight. When the wind came down from the ridge and the pines whispered like a big crowd that agreed on the same joke, the turnout looked ordinary. It still hid a storage of rags and coolant. It still held a book with entries written in hands that learned patience from asphalt. It still sat 3 miles past the crest, where trucks let their brakes breathe, and people learned to slow down enough to see one another. He remembered the first time he had levered the tin from the dust, felt the weight of words that did not need a speech. He thought about the winter calls, the quick hands at the hub, the quiet driver who blocked a box and made the math different. He thought about how a secret can be a responsibility more than a thrill, and how some secrets work best when shared carefully and left mostly unremarked. Arlene kept handing out maps and sandwiches, the cashier kept teasing drivers about their sweet tooth, and Theo kept trading radios for stories he liked better. The deputy kept watching Mile 32 from an angle that made crews uncomfortable, and the plaza lights kept throwing a honey glow across damp pavement after late rain. The road kept moving people who carried every kind of trouble and hope inside their glove boxes and on their dashboards. The ledger held a few blank pages that looked like future mornings and late nights, and the latch kept closing with a soft click. Travelers kept adding lines that sounded like a handshake, and the turnout kept holding small proof that strangers can decide to be neighbors. The book did not stop every scheme, but it hurt the margins enough that different plans made more sense than the old fast money ones. Ivo still checked the culvert after storms, still measured sediment against last season, still logged a snake sighting when a thicket rattled like loose change. He knew the ledger would change hands again eventually, not because he wanted it, but because the road decides and the people follow. He trained a new hire to watch for bolts that work loose and told him that some fixes start with a pencil and a jar. If anyone asked why the turnout mattered, he would point to the cabinet and the scrub pines and the clean lines of the rail. He would say that a book of simple favors became a ledger of safety, and that safety looked ordinary until you added up the lines. He would not mention names, and he would not tell a single hero story, because none of it needed that kind of shine. The highway kept its stubborn rhythm, and the ledger kept its quiet balance, and both felt honest in a way that made sense. The secret was not really a secret anymore, not to the people who needed it and respected what it asked. It asked for neat lines, shared tools, clear times, and the courage to arrive with hazards on and no need for applause. The stories. Night Guard, who followed footprints beyond the bridge. The first prints showed on a cold night when the river smoked and the closed bridge let out a slow iron groan. Frost held the gravel in a crust, so every step someone took across the municipal yard snapped like thin glass. Merrick Holland worked nights because he liked quiet places and because the warehouse paid overtime when storms rolled in. He was 41 by the last week of January, and he kept his thermos on the dash while he did his rounds. His plan was simple that night. Check the north fence. Check the generator shed. Sign the log before dawn and head home on the empty road. He saw the prints on his second pass, and their path made little sense when he stood still to study them. The footprints curved toward the pedestrian bridge that crossed the narrow river, which had been closed since late autumn while crews waited on parts. A chain-link panel barred the entrance with a sign that warned about unsafe decking, and Marek knew the sign by heart. He radioed the dispatcher with a routine note, since procedure made repeaters of careful guards. He kept his words easy. He said there were footprints where there should be none, and that he would check closer. The reply was scratchy and bored, and Marek almost laughed at the familiar tone. The treads were small and tidy, like work boots with a diamond pattern, and each step pressed the frost to a dark oval. The prints went right up to the chain-link panel, then slipped under at a low spot where someone had pulled wire loose. Marek knelt and touched the ground, and cold shot through his glove while he reset the bent ties. He peered down the dark shape of the bridge and decided he would not walk out there in the cold wind, not without telling someone first. He called again, then kept his flashlight tight to the decking while he stepped forward, and he felt the bridge vibrate under his boots. He moved slow, because he always moved slow when he could choose between slow and fast. Halfway across, the prints turned to powder as the frost thinned, and he had to scan both sides for scuffs on the gray boards. He found a faint line where grit had dragged, like something heavy had been pulled by rope. On the far side, the deck ended at a set of concrete steps that dropped to the river path, and here the prints deepened again. They pointed left, past an old pipe cradle and a low stand of scrub willow. Reports in the fall had mentioned fissures along the bank after hours, which was normal, and a few had been moved along without trouble. A clerk at the gas station had told an officer that a man bought batteries and duct tape in the same visit, which was normal enough, though people sometimes remember strange details when asked at night. Dispatch logs showed power dips near the intake station from time to time, and maintenance had chalked that up to loose connections in cold weather. Marek followed the prints along the river path until they vanished near a patch of bare gravel that the sun struck most days, even in winter. He stood there and listened. Somewhere upstream, an owl made 3 soft calls, and a semi rolled past on the highway with a roar that shook the willow branches. He decided he had gone far enough for one night. He photographed the prints on his phone and headed back, and he wrote a careful note in the log before dawn. By the next shift, the frost lifted late, and the yard lights burned a clean white circle on the gravel. Marek checked the generator shed first and noticed something he could not shake. The small lock on the diesel cap was scuffed, and a scratch ran from the cap to the lip like a hose had rubbed while someone steadied a weight. He checked the fuel slip from the last delivery and did the quick math. The level looked low by a few gallons, which could happen, and which also could not. He spoke with Celia Karp in maintenance the following afternoon because Celia knew more about the place than anyone in the office. Celia was 58 and had worked 3 floods and 2 droughts, and she kept a pocket notebook with every code for every panel. She said the power dips had been shrugged off by city, and that nobody had time to pull the panels until spring. She said the bridge closure made her nervous because blocked paths invite shortcuts. On the 3rd night, Marek went to the bridge before his first pass, and he crouched at the chain-link panel with a small bag of sidewalk chalk from the supply closet. He rubbed a pinch of red chalk into the dirt under the gap and dusted the decking where the prints had scuffed before. He wanted a way to tell if someone crossed again, and he wanted to see where the dust went when the night did its work. He made his rounds slower than usual and kept his eyes on corners where things hide without trying. The radio remained quiet until midnight. Then a call came in about a coyote by the south gate. Marek drove down and found only wind, and he thought the call felt like a joke he had heard before. He logged it anyway, because logs are the bones of quiet jobs. When he returned to the bridge, his light caught the faintest red sunset on the boards, and he felt alert in the way he liked. The chalk had smeared in a thin line toward the far steps, and the dust trailed down to the river path. On the gravel, small red flecks marked an arc that led behind a stack of old culvert pipe where few people bothered to look. He moved closer and found a cooler wedged inside a culvert mouth, and an inverter buzzed inside like a tired hornet. A length of clear hose lay coiled by the cooler, and the nozzle had a strip of duct tape where a leak had been patched. The setup looked temporary and careful, like someone trusted routine more than luck. Marek called dispatch, and his voice stayed even while he chose words that would not set hairs on necks. An officer drove down the service road and met him by the culvert, and they stood and listened together. The officer did not rush, which Marek respected, and the two men watched the bridge until the wind shifted. The officer said he would put a note on the morning brief, and he asked Marek to keep eyes open without playing hero. The phrase made Marek smile, and later he did not tell that part to anyone. In the days after, Marek traced the quiet pattern that repeats when someone abuses access. He checked camera angles and discovered the north yard camera had been bumped on a date that matched a power dip, and the new angle showed the sky more than the gate. He opened the back of the housing and found 3 screws missing, which was always a tell. He measured the footprints with a scrap of tape and got the same length each time, which told him the walker was careful with steps or else was one person always. He walked to the diner 2 blocks away during the afternoon and chatted with the cook named Huxley, who knew every vehicle that rolled through after midnight. Huxley said a man in a dark jacket sat late 2 nights a week, always with a single cup of coffee and a pocket radio on the booth seat. Huxley said the man tipped exact change and left when the freight trains crossed the river, which happened near the time Marion Street patrol cars swapped shifts. At the yard, a temporary guard from an agency had been filling 2 nights that Mark traded away for overtime on weekends. The temp signed the log with 2 letters and a quick crooked line. The initials were H and P, which matched about 1,000 people and which could match none. Marek did not care for suspicion as a hobby, yet he did not care for coincidences when fuel levels fell in quiet inches. He sat in his sedan before shift and went through old notes in his glove box where he kept manuals and photocopies. A contractor named Deacon Varelli had lost access in 2017 after a billing fight, and his crew had worked the intake station on that very river path for years. Marek wrote the name on a small card, then tossed the card at once, because names can lead you down the wrong hall. He kept his attention on the temp schedule instead, and he compared logs against the chalk nights and the reported coyote calls. On a dry Tuesday, red chalk showed again on the gravel, and the cooler in the culvert had moved 2 feet, which looked like a nervous person trying to outsmart the obvious. Marek called the non-emergency number and asked for a quiet presence, and officers waited with their lights low behind the old salt shed. Marek did his rounds with wide loops and checked his watch without seeming to check, and he waited on the near side of the bridge by the chain link panel. A figure came over the crest like a shadow that had business, and the boots set down in precise little ovals. The man wore a dark jacket with reflective piping like the agency issued, and he carried a duffel that sagged from weight. Marek stepped forward and kept his light on the ground, and he spoke steady without trying to sound like an actor. He said the bridge was closed by order of city, and he asked if help was needed. The man froze and looked left toward the culvert, which told Marek the only thing he really needed to know. The officers stepped from behind the shed, and everything stayed dull and true from there. The duffel held a 12-volt pump, a power bank, and 2 hoses cut to different lengths. The cooler held the inverter and spare tape and a stack of empty hand warmers, which can keep batteries alive just long enough between dips. The generator diesel cap carried the same tape residue as the hose, which tied the loop neatly enough for any careful mind. In the report that later circulated, details sat plain without flourish, which is how such documents talk to the world. The temp guard was named Harley Pruitt, age 36, and he had worked a roster of small night jobs that rewarded boredom more than skill. Archived calls showed he had reported animal movement at the south gate on the nights when the pump likely ran, which kept eyes away from the river path. Store security footage from across the highway reportedly showed a man matching his build, buying duct tape and batteries on a schedule that matched power dips at the intake station. Celia came down with a wrench the following morning and replaced the generator cap, and she tightened every panel on every camera while humming through her teeth. She shook Marek's hand with hard gratitude, and she told him the thing she always tells the new ones. Quiet places are never empty, and attention is the difference between a close call and a cleanup. People in town talked for a day. And then they talked about weather and games and a boat stuck on the ramp. Merrick logged his shift and ran a cloth across the dusty dash. And he looked once at the bridge where the chain link panel still hung crooked. He felt a small weight lift, which felt almost like pride, and then he felt something more like relief. He went back to the prints in his head, and he ran the path out again from the first night to the last. The steps had led beyond the bridge in the way tracks tell their whole story, and the red chalk had given him a quiet map. He thought about the way a small problem can hide inside a larger closure, and how a closed bridge invites someone to think rules are only suggestion. He drove the empty road home before dawn, and the river threw thin fog across the low bend like quiet breath. Merrick did not decide to keep working nights forever, and he did not make any grand vow. He thought instead about the small habits that keep a place honest, and the way a single set of prints can reveal a patient plan. In a town that prefers routine, a careful person with time can pull things apart slowly, unless another careful person keeps watch and asks simple questions that carry weight. By spring, the bridge opened again with new planks that smelled like fresh-cut pine, and families leaned on the rail to watch geese slide by. Some people remember a rumor when they cross, while most only hear water and light traffic and the chatter of kids. Merrick crosses when his route calls for it, and he never looks for drama, though he notices scuffs out of habit and checks if gates sit straight. He keeps chalk in the glove box still, and he keeps a small card that reminds him that attention wins more often than luck. The card does not carry a name, and it does not need one, because the lesson was simple and dull and true. He followed footprints beyond a bridge that everyone ignored, and he found a tidy machine made for taking small pieces of a place that trusted silence. Quiet work gave him back a little faith, which is worth more on a night shift than any badge or speech. When people ask him why he noticed, Marek says it was the shape of the morning frost and the numbers that never add fair. He tells them he just kept walking where the prince asked him to go, and he wrote things down when they mattered. He says a bridge is still a path even when closed, and that someone will use that fact to their advantage at least once. The rest of the time, he does not say much, and he lets the town hold its small stories without fuss, because most of them end with someone paying attention and returning what does not belong to them. The stories. Ranger station logs noted a missing hiker at noon. The radio crackled just after lunch, and the clipboard showed a blank line beside a borrowed bear spray canister. The word missing sat in block letters on the duty sheet, and the clock over the map board ticked louder than usual. Renata Vale worked the desk that week, 38, seasonal ranger with a stubborn streak for clean paperwork. The station sat outside a popular canyon where the trail ran through scrub pine, and July heat made the air taste metallic. Her plan for the day was simple: clear the lost and found shelf and call 2 vendors about water filters. Plans changed when a volunteer handed her the trail phone and said a worried brother was holding. He said his sister failed to text from the halfway point, and he used the word routine like a spell. He gave a name that did not exactly match the sign-in sheet, and his voice thinned when Renata asked about clothing and pack color. He had a screenshot of their last conversation, time-stamped just before noon, and said a ranger blog recommended checking the canyon switchbacks first. Renata felt the quiet alarm that starts in a seasoned ranger's hands, the kind that steadies rather than shakes. She called the number on the permit sticker that matched the closest name, and a voicemail box chirped with a clipped greeting. She checked the station cameras that watched the parking turnouts and found a silver sedan rolling in at 10:20. The driver wore a brimmed hat and taped the ends of the laces, a detail Renata wrote down because details age poorly when pressure arrives. The volunteer named Marco searched the trailhead kiosk for the morning log, while Renata stepped into the sun and scanned the ridge. Wind pushed dry heat across the gravel, and a jay scolded from the utility pole. She keyed dispatch and said they had a potential overdue hiker, not confirmed, and that initial checks were underway. She kept the language tight because words build momentum, and momentum brings helicopters that the budget cannot always afford. A woman in gym shorts approached with a dog and said she had heard a shout near the lower falls, short and sharp like a name. The dog sniffed the air and leaned toward the creek, then lost interest and sat her down. Renata asked about time and direction, then thanked her and pressed the note card against the map with a magnet. Witness statements fail without anchors, so she pinned the details to the grid and reviewed them aloud. Marco returned with the binder of trail camera stills that interns pulled from a motion unit near the bridge. The images showed the brimmed hat at 11:16, then again at noon on the switchback above the falls. The shirt color looked different under the dappled light, a common effect on digital stills that gave Renata a moment of doubt. She printed 2 frames and circled the pack strap, then clipped them to a clipboard for the field check. Her simple plan melted fully when dispatch called back with archived calls. A person had phoned the tip line at 11:42 and asked about trail closures on the East Rim, then hung up when asked for a callback number. The caller used a masked service that had failed before, and the audio had that empty room sound that suggested a roadside kiosk or a cheap motel. Renata pressed a knuckle against the map and agreed to log the call as related. She put together a step-by-step, starting light and staying local to the canyon. First, a hasty sweep from the bridge to the switchbacks with 1 ranger and 1 volunteer. Second, a parking lot inventory to match plates to permits and to note any vehicles with cooling engines that did not match sign-ins. Third, a witness walk with the dog owner to the lower falls, with a promise to return her to the trailhead within the hour. She radioed the plan and heard the click of acknowledgement from Wyatt Perales, 32, trail tech and steady boots in rough ground. They moved out along the creek, and the summer smell shifted from dust to algae and sunscreen. A couple in sun hats pointed to a narrow ledge where someone had left a crushed water bottle and a candy wrapper. Renata photographed the area with a department phone, then bagged the trash because trash turns into stories when the wrong eyes find it. She kept her sentences short on the radio and noted her times with a pen that left grooves deeper than the ink. At the switchback, Wyatt found boot scuffs that angled off the tread and into scrub so tight it would punish any shortcut. He pointed to a pressed patch of grass, then to a low branch with a pale scrape that matched soft plastic. Renata crouched and saw a faint thread from athletic tape, the same color she remembered from the still. The thread clung to rough bark, a small but useful tether between the images and the ground. They moved higher and reached a shallow spur where the view opened into a dry basin. On the spur, a pair of hikers said they passed a woman alone who looked back often, as if waiting for someone who never arrived. The hikers spoke slowly and paused to remember, then agreed to write brief statements at the station later that afternoon. They offered a photo from a distance that showed only a shape in heat shimmer, and the horizon looked bleached and wide. Renata asked the brother for more context by text, keeping questions narrow and practical. What snacks did she favor? Any injuries last year? And did she ever speak about this specific canyon? He replied that his sister planned the hike to test a new route from a guide forum and sent a blurry screenshot of a message board thread. A username bragged about a hidden shelf that saved 20 minutes, and that sentence pressed a new line into Renata's plan. She called the district's archive and asked for old incident notes related to the shelf, and the clerk said there were 2 minor rescues on a heat weekend 3 summers ago. Those notes described short slips and stubborn walkers and contained a detail that felt right and wrong at the same time. Both incidents started at noon when shadows shortened and depth perception failed, and both involved hikers who disliked crowds and sought quiet. Another message arrived from the brother that changed tone from worried to careful. He said a coworker reportedly spotted a silver sedan at a grocery near the highway at 1:30 with the brimmed hat visible through the windshield. He said the coworker did not want to get involved, and that felt useful in a different way. Renata thanked him and wrote the time down, then circled highway with a question mark that drew a slow breath from Wyatt. They pushed through Manzanita to reach the rumored shelf and found it narrower than described, with a crumbling margin that looked unfriendly. A faint shoe print showed a split tread that matched a popular brand, and a smear on the rock smelled like cheap bug spray. Wyatt anchored a line to a juniper and leaned just far enough to see a small alcove with shade and a clean view of the bridge. A person could wait there unseen, then return to the trail when passing groups moved on. Renata called dispatch to log the shelf and asked for a quiet check on the grocery footage if the store manager would allow it without a formal request. She kept the ask light, and the clerk at the store reportedly agreed to review only the parking lot from 1:15 to 1:45. While they waited, they spoke to a fisherman who said he had heard someone practicing a greeting near the bridge, polite and warm, the way people rehearse before calling an office. They returned to the station to regroup, and found the dog owner had kept her promise about the statements. She drew a crude map of her walk and marked the spot where the shout came, which lined up with the shelf by a neat stroke. Renata checked the plate list from the lot, and one entry bothered her because the registration sticker covered an older color. That usually meant a cheap repaint, often done quickly when a car changes hands among friends. The call from the store came back while the clock swept toward 4. Footage reportedly showed a silver sedan near the outer edge, and the driver wore a brimmed hat. The camera caught the driver opening the trunk, then closing it without removing anything. The driver sat for a full minute, then left the lot with a slow signal that suggested careful timing rather than confusion. That action made less sense if a hiker was lost, and more sense if a narrative needed space. Renata asked the brother to send any recent photos of his sister's gear so they could match brands and colors to the thread on the branch. He sent a camping picture from spring, and the pack straps matched the stills with unnerving accuracy. He also sent a photo of a laminated media badge from a fitness channel and apologized for forgetting to mention that side gig. Renata stared at the badge and felt the click of pieces rubbing into place. She pulled the permit files again and found a second entry from the morning that used a near match to the name, with a transposed letter that looked accidental at first glance. The second entry had a note in different handwriting that said, "Early shoot near bridge, approved by office." The office had approved no such shoot as far as Renata knew, and a deep memory of an email warning about unauthorized product videos rose to the surface. Those videos sometimes used stage trouble to capture attention, then rode the wave for clicks and ad buys. She contacted the regional office and asked whether a crew had requested permission that day, and the answer came back tidy and negative. The office asked for details, and Renata kept her language cool and focused on logs and times. She included the masked call and the quiet shelf, and the fact that a brimmed hat appeared where a plan would benefit from a dramatic turn. She asked for guidance on whether to treat the case as a welfare check or as a permit violation with a side of false alarm. Before the office replied, Wyatt flagged a new detail from the camera stills that had felt unimportant earlier. The brimmed hat in the second still carried a small pin that caught the sun, and the same pin appeared on the media badge in the spring photo. It was a tiny compass rose with 3 points bent, a logo for a training program that marketed grit and quiet strength. The pin created a line between online identity and trail identity, often a line people try to blur when views are currency. The volunteer team returned from the upper spur with a clean report and no sign of distress along the ridge. A group of teenagers said they watched a drone rise above the bridge and glide toward the shelf, then return quickly when someone shouted about rules. The teenagers filmed the drone on a phone, and the video captured the brimmed hat figure leaning on the railing, then turning away when the shout landed. Renata saved the clip and documented the time, then asked the group to leave contact details in case the office needed follow-up. As evening light softened, dispatch called with a quiet advisory. A patrol unit had found a silver sedan parked at a scenic turnout 15 miles east, empty and cooling, with a folded jacket in the back. The officer waited nearby without lights and reported a second vehicle pulling in close, then leaving when the cruiser rolled forward. The plate on the second car belonged to a rental agency with a flexible policy about credit cards, a detail Renata captured without judgment. The office finally replied and advised a welfare check with a parallel inquiry into misuse of emergency channels. They recommended a measured approach that prioritized safety and avoided public drama. Renata agreed, and then called the brother again and asked him to come to the station, explaining that in-person rooms make details easier to manage. He arrived with shoulders high and hands careful, and he looked like someone who disliked being on the wrong side of a counter. He admitted the channel sometimes staged challenges, and that his sister had pitched a solo speed test that needed daylight and a sense of risk. He insisted that no real danger was planned, only a late check-in, followed by a triumphant return, and a lesson about preparation. He said a friend reportedly stood by with water near the highway, and the masked call was about closures, because crowds ruin dramatic timing. He said he panicked when she missed the planned text by a full hour and called the station because the bit felt wrong. Renata listened and typed, then asked to speak with the sister by phone. The brother made a call on speaker, and the brimmed hat answered with a small breath. Then a quick apology that sounded practiced. She said she was safe and nearby, and that she feared trouble once she realized how many people had watched the bridge. She agreed to meet at the station within 30 minutes and added that the shelf was a mistake because the rock felt greasy and mean. She arrived with salt on her face and a steady gaze, 34, freelance trainer and editor for a mid-sized channel. She wore the pin on the brim and kept her hands open on the counter, then gave a full account that matched much of the timeline. She described the shelf and the alcove and admitted the staged silence to build tension for a cut. She said the drone operator backed out when a shout scared him and that the grocery stop was a pause to decide whether to end the bit early. Renata walked her through the consequences with a calm voice and clear steps. They would log the misuse of the term missing in the station ledger and forward a report on the masked call to the office. They would recommend a fine for the drone flight near the bridge and review the permit files for the transposed name entry. They would also offer a voluntary donation to the volunteer team for the hours spent and recommend a public safety note if the channel posted any edited footage. The woman nodded and said she understood, then asked whether the station planned to call the county. Renata said the county dispatch already sat in the loop and had agreed to remain cooperative as long as the channel avoided inflaming viewers. She added that the station took missing reports seriously because moments consume resources, and that even staged quiet pressures real systems. The woman agreed to record a clear statement and accepted a brochure on safe filming that looked oddly gentle in the harsh light. Wyatt stepped outside and watched the last cars roll out of the lot, and the air finally cooled enough to feel kind. The dog from earlier barked once from a passing truck, and the fisherman from the creek lifted 2 fingers without slowing. Renata filed the forms and wrote a final note that tied the shelf to the old rescues and the pin to the badge and the masked call to timing. The station lights hummed and the clock hands slid past 6, then found their mark without ceremony. By the time the brother and sister left, the word missing on the duty sheet had a line through it. Renata kept the original note card with the magnet hole because records tell stories when memory wants to embellish. The office would likely call tomorrow and ask for clarifications, and the drone policy would probably gain a new sentence. She felt the usual mix of relief and irritation that follows a false alarm, and the strange sympathy for people who turn risk into currency. Later, the channel posted a short video that downplayed the panic, and the comments argued about rules and grit. The station received 2 thank you emails from hikers who heard the news secondhand, and a complaint from a person who disliked the fines on principle. Renata archived the messages and watered the plant on the windowsill, then wrote one more line in the log about the shelf that was not a shortcut. The sentence ended with a plain warning that noon creates flat shadows and false confidence, a small truth inside a larger one. In quiet moments after a shift like that, she believed most people want a story that forgives them. Trails do not forgive, they teach. And the classroom never closes just because cameras blink. The station would open again at 7, and the clipboard would carry new names, and the clock would tick in the same steady way. Somewhere on the ridge, a jay would scold the wind, and the shelf would wait with its narrow promise, ready to turn bravado into paperwork. The stories. The librarian who reopened maps after one voicemail. The voicemail hit the library phone system at 9:16 in the morning, and staff noted the time on the call sheet. The town's map room had been shuttered since 2016 for budget reasons, with the keys sealed in a gray envelope. Rhea Calder was 38 and worked as a reference librarian, and she was supposed to weed duplicate travel guides. She liked lists and quiet projects that finished by closing time, and she intended to be home before the streetlights switched on. She opened the staff mailbox for routine messages, and the new voicemail had a subject line that looked wrong. The timestamp matched today, yet the voice sounded grainy and old, like cassette tape found in a hot attic. The caller sounded rushed but clear, and he used a steady dispatcher tone that carried through the static. He said the emergency detour map in the bridge packet had its north arrow wrong, and the depot road turn would strand drivers. He named 2 intersections locals would recognize, and he said the paper copy got flipped during a late-night duplication. He asked whoever heard this to check the flat files in the public map room, and then he hung up fast. Rhea paused because the library was planning a small display for the bridge reopening next week. The town crew wanted visitors to see old blueprints and printed maps, and the staff had quietly promised to unseal the room. She replayed the message and wrote down every location, and she typed the intersections into the library catalog notes. The bridge packet sat behind the desk in a manila folder, and she slipped the detour sheet out with a quiet tug. The detour looked normal at first glance, and the label fonts matched the county style guide. The north arrow pointed toward the top of the page, and a thick red line wrapped through 3 turns like a ribbon. She looked for a small staff stamp, and there it was near the border in faint purple. It said copied from firehouse drawer after warehouse incident, which the old reference notebook linked to 2009. Her job and training lived in the overlaps between paper and people, and she felt the old itch to confirm. The warehouse incident had clogged the streets for days, and archived calls reportedly mentioned bad directions at least twice. She brought the folder to the workroom and pulled the microfilm drawer, and the metal slides rasped against old paint. Dispatch logs on film listed closed streets and detours, and operators marked trouble points with pencil circles. 2 logs from the same night mentioned Depot Road, and the note said trucks turned the wrong way toward the river. One line said, "See temporary detour plate beside flat file B," which sounded like a direct breadcrumb. Flat file B waited in the locked room behind the genealogy shelves, and the envelope with the keys lived in a safe. She signed a paper acknowledging responsibility for access, and she carried the keys with both hands like a relic. The map room smelled like dust and linen, and the ceiling fan ticked from a loose blade. She slid open a drawer and found rolled sheets, and brittle plastic sleeves stuck to their neighbors like leaves after rain. The temporary detour plate was a stiff board with a taped photocopy, and someone had written mirror warning in grease pencil. The north arrow had a big X over it, and a second arrow pointed to the right side with the word up. She spread the board on a table and placed washers on the corners, and the paper fought to curl back into memory. The Depot Road turn looked reversed compared to the packet, and the red line as drawn would lead drivers into gravel. Her phone compass showed north toward the windows, and the temporary plate matched her reading within a few degrees. The packet map disagreed by a wide margin, and her stomach tightened like it always did when details misbehaved. She printed a recent aerial photo from the county website, and she centered on Depot Road and the bridge approach. A water tower shadow ran northeast by the clock, and that matched the plate, but not the packet. She called Tomas Brink, who was 54 and ran maintenance, and she asked about the packet source. He said a volunteer scanned old map holders in the spring, and staff patched labels onto the county base. He remembered a late-night copy job at the firehouse during the warehouse week, and he thought someone flipped a master. He had no hard proof, but he told her to talk with a retired cartographer who lived near the marsh. The cartographer was named Lyda Morell, and she was 71 with careful eyes and a faded canvas jacket. Lyda said she had drawn the original emergency plates on Mylar, and she always sketched north as a small star. Lyda remembered the night the plates went missing, and she spoke like a teacher marking a board after a test. The firehouse copier worked only on the legal tray that night, and someone fed the plate upside down, then pressed copy twice. Lyda said her handwriting on the board looked like her early notes, and she pointed to the grease pencil word up. She kept a photo from that week that showed 2 volunteers holding the board outside, and the sun angle matched. Rhea asked if the board ever returned to the library, and Lyda shrugged like she had told this story several times. She said yes, the board came back 2 days later, and someone tucked it into drawer B and shut the room. Rhea documented everything as if the board could grow legs and escape, and she wrote dates beside each step. She took photos of the board and the packet, and she copied the microfilm lines, and she initialed each printed page. The voicemail still bothered her, because the timestamp said today, yet the content smelled like an old headache. She checked the library phone system logs, and a vendor note explained a recent server migration for stored voicemail. An alert said a batch of delayed messages had been flushed to mailboxes, and the explanation used dry language and disclaimers. She asked the vendor to search for the caller number, and they returned an old service name with a billing code. The code matched a dispatch line used during the warehouse week, which explained the voice and the choice of words. Someone had recorded this warning years ago, and the system had kept it like a seed in a jar. Rhea asked if the caller name could be released, and the vendor sent a redacted sheet with initials and a job title. A local news archive matched the initials to a night guard who reportedly died of natural causes in his parked car. The guard had phoned the correction before the medical event, and he had tried to reach any desk that could fix the map. His message never reached a human while the roads were jammed, and the bad copy camped in a drawer. Rhea brought her notes to Tomas, and he carried the folder to a brief meeting with the town clerk. The clerk asked for confirmations and a plan, and Rhea offered a clear sequence that would be easy to retrace next year. Step 1 was to treat the packet map as untrustworthy and to replace it with a fresh export from the county base. Step 2 was to reconcile the arrow with on-site compass readings and to annotate with the date and the staff initials. Step 3 was to scan the temporary board and let the grease pencil speak and to place its image in the appendix. Step 4 was to add a small note in the bridge display and to credit anonymous archival materials for clarifying the route. Tomas drove to Depot Road with her after lunch, and they parked near a mailbox whose nameplate had peeled away. The river ran dull and brown beside the road, and a detour sign leaned like a tired person after a long shift. Rhea stood where the red line on the packet would have sent traffic, and she looked through cottonwoods at rough gravel. The correct route followed a narrow paved lane to the east, and the wrong turn aimed drivers toward a soft shoulder. A school bus rolled past on the narrow lane, and the driver waved like this was already muscle memory. The aerial photo printed in the morning matched the bus path, and the packet map did not. They stopped by a small clinic 2 turns away, and the nurse behind the counter remembered the warehouse week. The clinic took calls from stranded drivers, and a nurse reportedly walked out to redirect a line of cars at sundown. The town clerk approved the correction that afternoon, and the county uploaded a clean detour with verified arrows. Tomas signed off on new signs, and the bridge crew shrugged like this was just another Tuesday with wet concrete. Rhea asked for permission to open the map room weekly, and the clerk looked toward the budget with a careful tilt. The request had no funding yet, but the clerk liked the argument that open rooms produce fewer expensive mistakes. They agreed on a one-afternoon schedule under staff supervision, and Rhea posted a notice near the staircase. She placed the temporary board in a display case with a modest label, and she kept the packet map below it with a sticky note. The sticky note said obsolete and see corrected version, and she included the date and her initials for future sanity. A footnote in the display explained that a delayed voicemail triggered the review, and no personal names appeared. At the reopening of the bridge, the mayor shook hands and cut a ribbon, and the appetizers ran out fast. Drivers moved through the new approach like water down a smooth bed, and the detour signs wandered into storage. Tomas clapped her shoulder near the coffee urn, and he said quiet fixes rarely get banners, which is the point. Lyda visited the display the next morning, and she pressed her fingers against the glass like she was reading Braille. Rhea listened to the old voicemail one more time, and the voice had that tired confidence that comes from night work. He had said, please check the flat files, and it felt like he was speaking across a hallway rather than across years. On her desk, she kept a small notebook with 3 lines that she repeated when projects became slippery. Write down names of things as they are used, compare them to how they look on paper, test the direction with the Sunday. She added a 4th line in light ink to mark the lesson that felt both new and as old as maps. If a voice says the arrow is wrong, open the drawer before the parade trucks roll and the cameras arrive. In the months that followed, the room gathered quiet visitors, and the fan still ticked, but less often after tightening. Folks brought rolled plats from garages, and Rhea labeled them carefully, then scanned and returned them with fresh sleeves. A contractor volunteered 2 hours a week to help with filing, and he taught her to spot scale bars that lied. Teachers brought students to trace creeks with cotton thread, and one kid noticed a benchmark star on the courthouse steps. The bridge display came down after the season changed, and the temporary board went back into drawer B with a proper sleeve. A small typed note inside the sleeve told the story in 12 lines, with dates and initials and measured claims. It said a voicemail arrived and matched earlier dispatch references, and staff verified the arrow with compass and aerial evidence. It said a clean map replaced the packet version before the reopening, and the town's roads agreed. Rhea did not call it a miracle, and she did not call it fate, because both words would cheapen 12 careful steps. She called it library work, which sounded plain, yet it held more weight now that a ribbon had been cut. On quiet afternoons, she stood at the window where the compass had pointed, and she felt the same small pull. North was where the light made honest shapes on paper and where a tired voice could still find the right room. When she locked the door each week, she thought about the man who made the call, and she wished he had been heard. His warning crossed an odd gap in the system, and it landed like a folded note slid under a door. In a town where stories often arrive secondhand, the plain ones sometimes carry the longest mileage. One message, one board, one arrow corrected, and a room reopened so a drawer could be opened without ceremony.